I don't think it's been my pleasure on previous, what?
Who's talking?
I don't think I've had the pleasure of introducing Don before. We've spoken at many places, but I haven't introduced him. He hasn't, I don't think you've ever introduced me, did you? Doesn't matter. Okay. We have the pleasure, those few of us who managed to stick it out this late, to turn out to hear Don Schmitt. And Don and I have a close connection. I mean, we don't throw things at each other too often. But I remember he attended a lecture I gave at a college in Illinois. He drove down from Wisconsin. And he asked me an interesting question. He said, do you think there's any more work to do on Roswell, or has it already been done? This is back in the 80s, I guess. 88. And I said, Don, look, I think there's loads more to be done, but I just don't have the time or the money to do it. I live back in eastern Canada. This trekking back and forth is expensive. There are many people to find. That's expensive too. Back then, before the internet, you know, you use the telephone. You remember the telephone. So I encouraged him and said, I'll cooperate in any way I can. And so he began. He worked with Kevin. I don't see Kevin. Oh, okay. We've had our ups and downs, more ups than downs in the last 10 years or so, I'd say. Because there are some things we disagree about, but in principle, we're in agreement about a great deal about what happened at Roswell. So Don has many talents. Surviving a tough operation on his head is one. I don't know how he managed that. He's an athlete. He's a musician. He worked for the post office in Hartford? Hartford, Wisconsin, yeah. Undoubtedly surprised when I called him one day. There'd been disagreements among some of the researchers. So anyway, he's been at it a long time on Roswell. And he's been down there, I don't know how many times, but it's over how many? Over 100 trips. Now that's dedication. He's been a big help to the people at the museum, to the city help. The books have done a lot to educate people. And he's still going at it. I mean, I live much further, but he's still in Wisconsin, which is not exactly next door to New Mexico. So he should be commended for all the effort, all the time, all the encouragement. And you know, I said something years ago that's come back to haunt me. I said we're racing the Undertaker. And boy, are we. So it gives me great pleasure to present to you Don Schmitt, a premier investigator of the Roswell incident, who doesn't have a...
After our panel this afternoon, I don't know how much is left to be said, but I take it most of you are here, and so I hope we made somewhat of an impact, albeit a case that happened now going on 66 years ago. But nonetheless, we still feel it's the granddaddy of all UFO cases. It's the one incident that not only are we talking about physical evidence, physical remains, but deathbed testimonies, documentation. We're talking about a case where we can actually go out to the site and conduct archaeological work with the hope of finding that needle in a haystack. Tonight I'm going to focus because I feel as Stan mentioned, the race with the undertaker, that more than ever before we're encountering deathbed testimony, deathbed statements. And it was one of the things we emphasized this afternoon. There were a number of the Congress people that are attorneys, and how relevant, as far as within the practice of law, that a deathbed is admissible. It's considered physical evidence. And if we are to disqualify Roswell testimony, then we have to disqualify all deathbed testimony, which so often has put people on death row, has served as a final confession by a principal suspect in a crime. We cannot have it both ways. This is, unfortunately, as Stan even puts it, anything but extraterrestrial. And yet, these are the very people, we can document their participation. They were stationed in Roswell in 1947. From all accounts, they were involved. What's amazing about the entire mosaic of Roswell, there's very little discrepancy. You can plug in all the separate pieces of involvement. It's interesting how we have skeptics, and that's not even an accurate word. They're typically scoffers, they're debunkers. Because it will never matter what proof, what evidence. The President of the United States, whatever president, could go before the American people and announce this evening that we are being visited, that we've been visited for most likely centuries, that there are aircraft, there are objects that are flying through our airspace with total impunity and we can't do anything about it. But vote for me come next election. We have no control, but trust me, we have a handle on it. I, for one, believe it's because we don't have a handle on it. It's still a cover-up of ignorance. And such was displayed and demonstrated by the people back in 47. It's often suggested that we're not ready, we're not mature enough to handle such disclosure. This is the year 2013. And yet back in 1947, for the very people who were involved, there was no mass suicide, there was no panic in the streets. These people all lived out their lives, they raised their families, worked their jobs, went to church, and they were there. They were involved. They saw it firsthand. And it was long before there was Star Trek and Star Wars and anything of that sort. In other words, they handled it back in 1947. And as we have the one scene in the Roswell movie, the interrogation scene of the actor, country singer Dwight Yoakam playing the rancher Mac Brazel. And he's yelling, "I held it right in my hands." And that's the type of witnesses we're talking about. Jesse Marcel, Major Marcel, people that could say, "I held it in my hands." The Air Force would suggest that, well, we had explained many UFOs as being nothing more than weather balloons. Well, correct. At 10,000 feet, you can go through the Blue Book files. Many UFO reports were explained away as being nothing more than errant weather balloons. I'm sure we've all seen things at high altitude that, depending on the atmospheric air pressure, wind velocity, that type of thing, the reflective skin of the balloon can look unusual. But again, that's at a great distance. But when it's on the ground in front of you, it's the type of thing that even a 5-year-old child would recognize, would identify. That's what they never qualify regarding Roswell. It was the very thing that we tried to emphasize during our panel this afternoon. The very idea that the most elite unit within the military, the 509th Bomb Group in charge of the atomic bomb, could not recognize an off-the-shelf weather balloon. Now, we're not just talking about 1947 because the government, vis-a-vis the Air Force, is still asking us to accept that explanation as of today. And what's amazing is how many people within the media are still in lockstep with that explanation. As Stan knows, invariably, anytime you speak with a reporter, well, wasn't it this special balloon that was monitoring Soviet atomic bombs? It's the party line. You can talk to people within in the military. You know, Project Mogul, isn't that what it was? Look into it. Read. Examine as far as the people's record regarding Roswell, people who were actually involved. And that's what we're going to go over in the next 40 minutes, albeit quickly, because we'll have a lot to cover. So why don't we start with the first slide. Can you open it up? Yes. There we go. This is the cover, this is the jacket cover of the #1 selling UFO book in the world for 2007 and 2008. So to suggest that there's no interest, Stan and I hear this very often, that interest in Roswell is waning. That, oh, I didn't really, but thank you. Or that one, so whichever one. We hear this all the time. We hear this from colleagues, that, oh no, not another talk about Roswell. But again, it's the granddaddy of them all because it has all the best elements of any good UFO case. And I think it's the reason that so many of our colleagues, they would just relish. I've had people even in other professions who have suggested if they had a case like Roswell to work on, it would be their dream come true. Because it's the type of case that they make movies about, as they have and they will continue to. Next slide. That gentleman was the sheriff of Chavez County back in 1947, Sheriff George Wilcox. Now we're going to go through the whole series of deathbed testimonies. So next slide. That's a shot of him on the July 9th Roswell front page of the Roswell Daily Record. Made the remark at the time that he was cooperating with the boys at the base, the military personnel at Roswell Army Airfield. Next slide. That's the courthouse. This is where the rancher, Mac Brazel, most likely parked right here with his pickup truck and went up either side into the door. The sheriff's office was right here. And that's where he would have reported what he had discovered late evening, either July 3rd, we believe it was the 3rd, possibly the 2nd, and brought in an actual box of some of this wreckage. And even Sheriff Wilcox examining the material. Obviously, he couldn't make positive identification because he would dispatch 2 of his deputies to go check it out. At the same time, next slide. Next slide. Oh. A reporter by the name of Frank Joyce. That's not Frank Joyce, either one. But Frank Joyce from radio station KGFL would, for the first opportunity, get the story for the press. The problem that the military faced at that moment was that it was leaked. It was already out to the media. So they were doing all they could to contain the story. There was a call that came from an FCC agent by the name of Slowey, who called up the same radio station, KGFL, warned them that if they proceeded to put the story out, they would lose their license within 24 hours. And as everything was going down, and the rancher would lead two of the intelligence officers we talked about this afternoon, Major Jesse Marcel and Captain Sheridan Cavett. The sheriff kept a box of the debris, one of the boxes that the rancher, Mac Brazel, had originally brought in. He kept it in his office. In fact, his two daughters, that's the late Phyllis McGuire, and that's her sister, Elizabeth Tulk, both deceased, but we had them give us a tour. This is right after we did a video tour of the courthouse. They lived upstairs at that time, the family. So it would be a number of days later, there was a loud commotion outside the courthouse parking lot. And they heard vehicles coming in from all sides. And there was a stairway that they were able to look down into the front lobby, the front office, leading to their father's office. And they watched how MPs came in from all available doors, through the cafeteria, through the lockdown area, through the very front doors here, demanding to know where the rest of the wreckage, the rest of the material was. Both of the daughters described to us as they watched their father, the sheriff, being accosted, being physically pushed into his office, pushed up against the wall, and ordered to turn over the debris, the rest of the physical evidence that he had retained, brought in by the rancher. Now, what makes this significant, it was a day after the weather balloon explanation had gone out. So the press had already accepted that this was nothing more than a weather balloon device, a Rowan target, a neoprene rubber with a radar reflector kite. And yet the military was making sure they retrieved every last piece. We have numerous accounts, for example, of ranches having floorboards pulled up in sheds, going into ranch houses, dumping out dresser drawers, slitting open bags of feed, dumping over water tanks in an effort to retrieve every last piece of physical evidence. Now we're talking about a weather balloon. The point is we're not talking about a weather balloon. They're making sure they retrieve every last piece of physical evidence for a reason, because it's the physical evidence that would totally discount any type of balloon, any type of conventional explanation. They had to make sure that if this indeed was something manufactured off the planet, that it would not get out either to the press or to the public. Next slide. I'm going to skip next slide. This is Corporal Frank Cassidy. He was with the 1395th. This was an MP unit stationed at Roswell at that time. Now, you would think the MPs at Roswell would be some of the principal people involved to cordon off the site, to cordon off the roads, set up checkpoints, secure the activity, the full recovery operation. And we've determined through our investigation that they shifted personnel around and they selected key people from different squadrons. They brought in outside units. And it actually was quite ingenious. It was something they learned during World War II, especially in dealing with very sensitive, very secret activities. Now, just imagine this entire group of people here this evening, and you all belong to one unit in the military. And all of you are assigned to one project. And then you're told after the incident, the event, you're not to talk. You're to keep your mouth shut. But what's the problem when you consider that all of you are part of the same group? It's all the more difficult to contain as far as people's natural instinct to talk and compare and share notes with one another. But if I select you, and then I take someone from outside, and I take someone from another room, and at the end, when the dust clears, you're not in contact with one another. You can't perpetuate any type of discussion. So as a result, it also helps to contain the entire situation. That's precisely what they did at Roswell. The MPs at Roswell were not directly involved. They were on the peripheral. They selected other units, other personnel. Other personnel from other bases were even brought in. Corporal Cassidy, before he died in 1976, so this is 4 years before Roswell incident. So 4 years before the first book on Roswell was published. And he described to his wife that he was posted outside the big hangar at Roswell, P3, Building 84. And the first chance he had to look inside, he not only saw some of the debris scattered out on the floor, but he also saw a number of bodies under a canvas tarpaulin with just their heads exposed, and that they were not human. Next slide. This is P3. That's how it looked. You can see the vintage 1940s car. It's a B-29 hangar. You see there's a bit of almost a upper garage door in the upper portion of the hangar. That's where the tail section of the B-29 would slide through when they'd wheel them into the hangar. The Enola Gay, the boxcar, the two B-29s that dropped Little Boy and Fat Man on Japan, were hangared here after the war on different occasions. Next slide. We refer to this as the D. Proctor site. This is a secondary body site, even mentioned in the MJ-12 documents. It talks about bodies that were discovered about 2.5 miles from the debris field. This is about 2.5 miles east-southeast of the debris field. Proctor was the son of Floyd and Loretta Proctor. They lived on the nearest ranch to the Foster Ranch where this object exploded, where it rained debris throughout this site. Brazel was not the owner, he was the ranch foreman, he was the supervisor. The Proctors, being the closest neighbors, resided 10 miles away. Just imagine your nearest neighbor being 10 miles away. And Dee was working with Mac that particular weekend. 7 years old. You talk to people in New Mexico, as fast as you can walk, they put you on a horse. So it wasn't unusual for a 7-year-old to help herding the sheep, herd the cattle. He was with Brazel when he discovered the wreckage. And by all accounts, for the fact that they kept Brazel for almost a week at the base, remarks he made in front of his granddaughter, Fawn Fritz, about the poor unfortunate creatures, remarks he made to reporter Frank Joyce at KGFL about the bodies not being green, and other testimony that Brazel was in the company of a number of young boys when he discovered a number of bodies atop that ridge. Now, Proctor was always very elusive. He was a reluctant witness. He died just a couple years ago. His mother told us that he was there, but he wouldn't even admit anything to her or the rest of the family. First time we confronted her son, his reaction was, "I wasn't even born back then," which turned out to be quite a shock to his mother. There were other times we would arrive at the ranch house and he would slip out the back door and you would see his pickup truck shoot down the road away from us. That's how scared he was of us pinning him down and actually talking about this. His mother had a blood clot, life-threatening clot in her neck at one point. And this would be within the last 10 years. He would show up, said, "Mom, I need to show you something." He would take her up to the top of this ridge. So not to the debris field site, but to the top of this ridge, 2.5 miles away. And all he would say to her is, "Mom, this is where Mac found something else." That's as close as he would come. But we know what the something else was. Next slide. This is Sergeant Melvin E. Brown. He was with K Squad. Remember how I talked about different squads being involved? Well, K Squad was kitchen staff. But keep in mind, the members of the 509th Bomb Group all had a top security clearance. So even if you worked in the kitchen, you were part of the K Squad, you were sworn as far as you had a top security clearance, you were also there in charge of the atomic bomb, and you were no stranger to performing MP service. So Brown would be transferred to England within months of the incident. He would stay there, he would marry a British girl, and live out the rest of his life. 1985, he was in a hospital dying. And as a demonstration of just how profound, how important what he experienced was, he was sitting with his wife, and they knew he only had a few days left. He's still totally lucid. It's becoming emotional. His wife, even today when she describes it, she tears up. She describes how he takes her by the hand and he says to her, "Sweetheart, I need you to know that I've always been faithful to you. I've always been faithful to you." And then he goes on to tell her all about Roswell. He tells her that he was posted behind an ambulance truck from the base hospital. And he's told to keep his eyes forward. And the first chance he gets, and he lifts up a tarp, and he sees two of the bodies. And by his very description, they match again exactly. The short, 3.5 to 4 foot tall, the larger disproportionate head, larger eyes, very diminutive nose, ears, thin slit for a mouth, spindly, very thin bodies. The classic description that we get over and over again about the little men, the little people. And much to the credit of the witnesses at Roswell, they don't call them alien. They don't call them spacemen. They talk about the little people, the little men. But as one of the officers said, they sure weren't from Texas. Next slide. You can skip. Next. This is what I talked about other units again. This is Sergeant Homer Rollette. He was with the 603rd Air Transport Unit. Now the 603rd was much more involved. Where the 1395th MP was on the peripheral, as I mentioned, the 603rd was directly involved with the bodies. Now, Rollette would never say a word to his family, never said a word to anyone. He was true to his security oath. Next slide. It's a picture, there's his late wife, his granddaughter. It's his daughter, Carlene, and then there's Larry Rowlett. Now, Carlene would be with her father at a hospital just prior to undergoing open heart surgery. This was in the late 90s. And he would be on the gurney outside the operating room. She'd be waiting with him. And he would, very weakly, he waved her down where he could say something. And she bent over to hear what he had to say. And Carlene would describe to us, "You know I was at Roswell when that flying saucer crashed. It's true. It's all true. I saw the ship. I saw the bodies. And one of them was alive." Now, just again, imagine what would possess someone at that moment. Any one of you, whether your spouse or a son or daughter, before a life and death surgical procedure. And it's like, oh, I'm going to lie to my daughter right now. I'm going to tell her something that, I may not make it out of here, but I'm going to get one last practical joke on her. And he lived for another month. And she was not aware of the fact that before he went into the hospital, he confided the exact same information to her brother Larry. So, another deathbed, as it turns out, to a son and daughter. Admissible in a court of law for a reason. We can take the most hardened criminal, and why do you think that time and time again? Whether it's a member of the clergy, whether it's the FBI, whether it's law enforcement, before capital punishment so often, will you provide us with one last statement? Will you tell us where you hid the money? Will you tell us where the bodies are? Will you tell us the truth? And they're accepted as gospel for a reason. Because psychologists have demonstrated that especially in the closing days, weeks of someone's life, they are more apt, more likely than ever to finally tell the truth. And what the witnesses at Roswell, in the growing number of deathbed accounts, they're all telling the exact same story. No one's talking about 6-foot-tall wooden crash dummies. No one's talking about weather balloon debris. No one's talking about a rocket or aircraft. They're talking about physical material, I-beam sections with hieroglyphic symbology that ran the lengths. They're talking about strands of fiber-like material that you could hold a light up to one end, and the light would emit out the opposing end. This is in 1947. You're talking about larger sheets of material, paper thin, practically weightless. And yet, as Major Marcel described, they took a larger sheet about 4 foot in diameter, and they placed it on the ground. They took a 16-pound sledgehammer, and they tried to bang on it, and the hammer would just bounce right off. It would not even scratch the material. And then what we refer to as our Holy Grail, the material that, again, paper thin. You couldn't cut, you couldn't drill through, you couldn't burn, and yet you could crumble, you could crease, you could wad up, you could fold, and you'd place it down, and like quicksilver, it would flow like water. Just smooth right out with no sign of a crease or fold. 1947. And last I've observed, we're still flying aircraft and rockets constructed of aluminum, sheet metal, assembled by rivets, weld. Our car bumpers are made of plastics. Nothing that would match such materials. We're getting there. I'm often asked, well, this material was so indestructible or nigh indestructible. How did it break up? How did it explode? Anything that's malleable, anything that's manufactured, has to have a stress point, a fracture point. Quite simply, whatever this object's fracture point was, it was much higher than ours. And as the years have progressed, ours have also gone up more and more and more. We have polymers. We have all types of, they're talking even aluminized glass, ceramics, that type of thing, that are now becoming more and more useful in the construction of aircraft, heat resistance. We talk about the SR-71, the Blackbird, our super spy plane for over 30 years, was made of titanium, leaked like a sieve. They would have it hangared, and the fuel truck would pull up. They passed a hose in through the hole in the door of the hangar and fuel up the aircraft. And then the aircraft would come out, and the fuel would just be raining out of it because of the titanium being that hard, that brittle. And then once it would become airborne and reach supersonic speed, and it would start to even heat up from the friction of the air, it would fuse, it would seal itself, and it would then retain the rest of its fuel. Now, when was the Blackbird developed? In the late 50s, 10 years after Roswell, and it was our super spy plane for the next 30 years. When they announced when it was supposedly retired because they were going to rely on satellite technology. And we know that obviously we have something faster, something more advanced, something more sophisticated that took its place. But they talked about how that the Blackbird was able to fly from New York to LA in 1 hour. It gave us an idea just how fast we were talking. And again, an aircraft that was developed 10 years after something of unknown origin crashed outside of Roswell. Next slide. Let's skip this one. Next slide. This is Captain Miles Wani. He was one of the outside MPs that was brought in. He used to fly B-28, the bombers in World War II. He was called the Chief because he was a full-blood Comanche, Native American. And he too, before he died, confessed to his family that he was one of the guards posted at bomb pit number 1. You see, on the afternoon of July 9th, 1947, this is a day after the press release had gone out announcing the capture of the flying saucer. This was the day that the weather balloon explanation made banner headlines throughout the country and beyond. It's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mountain Time. Members of the 393rd Bomb Group were on a skeet range, and they were told to get ready for an unscheduled flight over to Fort Worth, over to Carswell Army Airfield. Carswell at that time was the headquarters of the 8th Air Force. Going up the chain of command from Roswell, the base commander at Roswell, Colonel William Blanchard, his boss was Brigadier General Roger Ramey of the 8th Air Force. So they were told that they were to be briefed and that they would be flying a B-29 over to Fort Worth. Well, their normal aircraft, the normal B-29 they were assigned to, was called the Necessary Evil. Well, for some reason, they weren't going to be flying their own aircraft. Because we also found firsthand testimony demonstrating that during the night, there was another B-29 called the Straight Flush that had its bomb bay modified to receive something else, something more than an atomic bomb. So they would take this other B-29, the Straight Flush, and they would taxi over bomb pit number 1. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, July 9th. And instead of there being a bomb, there was this rectangular crate. Miles Waney was one of the guards. Armed guards posted around the crate. There were men on the flight who we tracked down, who we interviewed. Lloyd Thompson, Robert Slusher, Edgar Skelly, Thaddeus D. Love, Felix Martucci. The crate would be loaded into the bomb bay. The guards would accompany it. Bomb bay was not pressurized, so they flew at less than 10,000 feet. They arrived at Fort Worth. There was a contingency of officers waiting on the tarmac. And the bombardier, Felix Martucci, recognizes a mortician that he had gone to school with years before, waiting for this cargo. He deboards the plane, says hello to his former schoolmate. They walk away together. The other men are ordered to stay on the plane. Some sandwiches, some drinks are brought out. Cargo, the crate is unloaded. The guards accompany it. And then they get ready to fly back to Roswell. Martucci would reboard the plane, and he would make the remark, "Boys, we just made history." So it was common knowledge that they flew some of the bodies out of Roswell. In fact, as we tracked down the very men I described, that I mentioned, Thompson, Slusher, they all died convinced that they were part of that special crew assigned to fly one group of the bodies out. A day after the weather balloon explanation. So the activity continues. In other words, the cleanup operation continues. The recovery operation continues. All while the press has essentially accepted the balloon explanation. Next slide. That is the very aircraft. Straight Flush. Next slide. This is the late Colonel Marion Magruder. Now, Magruder was not stationed at Roswell at that time, but he was with the War College. And in April of 1948, he was assigned to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And before he died in 1995, he would talk to his 4 sons. And each one, he confided that when they were at Wright-Patterson, they were shown the survivor from Roswell. They had an opportunity to actually see who he referred to as Squiggy, because of its spindly body, that it barely looked like it could, stand. The description, again, was consistent as far as the larger disproportionate head, diminutive features, but nonetheless, he was a triple ace from World War II, led lifetime raids into Japan in the final stages after Jimmy Doolittle in World War II. And that what would possess him before he would die to confide such a story to his sons? and that his information was that the survivor indeed was from Roswell the year before. Next slide. This is an actual photograph of that very class, Air War College class, 1947-48. That's Magruder right there. And we do have the documentation that he was assigned to Wright-Patterson in April of 1948, just as he told his sons. Next slide. Those who were at the panel this afternoon, you heard us very frequently refer to counterintelligence officer Sheridan Cavett, plainclothes, CIC, predecessor to the CIA. It was their primary function to essentially seek out Soviet spies. And yet Cavett was dispatched with Major Marcel to follow the rancher out to the site to investigate this crash. Cavett was the one who, for years, I wasn't involved, I wasn't there. No matter what documentation we provided, he finally had to admit being there, but I wasn't involved. Well, I was involved, but it wasn't anything extraordinary. And eventually to the point, well, I guess it could have been a flying saucer. Days after the balloon explanation, the Cavetts and the Marcells, you had Jess and Vi Marcel, and you had Sheridan and his wife Mary. They would get together and they'd play bridge at each other's homes on a weekly basis. So it's the first time after the incident they actually get together. And we further confirmed the story with Mary after her husband passed away, because we had some follow-up questions about what I'm about to describe. Well, according to Mary Cavett, on this particular night of cards, the women remained in the front room and the men were in the kitchen. Well, what were the men doing? Well, according to Mary, they were heating up a piece of the actual material, the real stuff, on the stove, trying to see if it would have, any effect. And her husband, Cav, as he was called, would remind Jesse that he better get rid of it. Better get rid of this because it's classified top secret. Well, after her husband would die, we'd go back up to Sequim, Washington, and we would ask her, was that story true, what you described? Now that your husband is gone, is there anything you can add to it? What became of that piece? Well, she went on to describe that the two men then went out onto the patio. It was a newly poured concrete slab. And when they came back in, the piece was gone. Now, this is the famous patio, and I say famous because it's been suggested for years that we should break up that concrete slab and see if there's anything underneath it. And one of the principal reasons was when her husband was still alive, when he was slowly leaking little tidbits of information. And I'm talking to Mary, and she's talking about that incident, heating up that piece of material on the stove. And I hear some grumbling in the background, and I think, oh no, now she's in trouble. Now we're both in trouble. Her husband just walked in the room. And the next thing I hear, he grabs the phone, and he goes, Don, did you boys ever think about breaking up that old Marcel patio? Well, Colonel, as a matter of fact, yes. Well, I would look into that. Well, the reason we haven't broken it up as of yet is that they built owners of the house since then have added on, and they built a family room over it, and we would essentially have to demolish half the house. We even had the Prince of Liechtenstein, Hans Adam, offer to rebuild the house if we wanted to tear it up in that fashion. So it's still something down the road. In fact, the Army has developed concrete penetrating radar that we're looking into for some future use. So that's the patio story. But interesting that even the witnesses who don't talk, they still try to, or they'll give you a little lead here, and there, like Colonel Edwin Easley, who we talked about this afternoon, when he was posed the question, you know which direction we're going. Can you at least tell us if we're going in the right direction? To which he responded, well, let's just say you're not going in the wrong direction. Plausible deniability. I didn't admit anything, but you're not going in the wrong direction. Next slide. That is Cabot's non-commissioned officer, Sergeant Louis Rickett. Rickett would talk to both Stan and myself on numerous occasions. Unlike his boss, Rickett went on to describe the material, described its characteristics, said it was all true, that indeed it was something off this planet, that it wasn't material that was manufactured here. Next slide. That was Marcel. We've talked about him. That's from the base yearbook from 1947. Next slide. That's Easley, who I just mentioned. Let's end on this because we're at the top of the hour. Because I mentioned Easley saying we weren't going in the wrong direction. This was after we found him in 1990, and we have him on tape stating over and over again, I can't answer that, I'm sworn to secrecy. We're out of the site. I can't answer that, I'm still sworn to secrecy, over and over again. 1990, he's still stating, I'm still sworn to secrecy. Well, it'll be 2 years later. He was in Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. He was dying of stomach cancer. And in the presence of his two daughters, one of them a practicing attorney, Nancy Strickland, and his granddaughter brought him a gift. And sitting down alongside his hospital bed, she held it up to him. And he turned away and went, oh, the creatures. It was a copy of our first book, UFO Crash at Roswell. And then he apologized to the family, acknowledged how the president, whether personally or an emissary, but nonetheless, had asked him never to say another word about the incident. Now, Easley was the provost marshal. He was in charge of all military security at the base, at the crash site, the debris field. He would have been in charge. We have the names and we have verified one of the Treasury agents, two of the Secret Service agents who were sent by Truman to Roswell to oversee the recovery operation. We have it also verified from a number of family members that the Secret Service agents admitted this years later. His daughter, Nancy Strickland, presented us with a copy of a commendation he had received, Colonel Easley had received from the Treasury Department from the summer of 1947, thanking him for his full cooperation during that operation that summer, without stating explicitly, specifically, but nonetheless, what other operation are we talking about? So, nothing to suggest that this was anything of a balloon, of an errant rocket, an aircraft, anything conventional. I will end with the very closing remark in the segment that we did with CBS 48 Hours. CBS News, when Dan Rather stated, "Truly something extraordinary crashed outside of Roswell, New Mexico in July of 1947." And I concur. Thank you. They're pretty tight as far as they want to sell.